All right, welcome everybody. I hope you can hear me well. This is Mr. Longacre. I'm sorry I couldn't be in class today, but we are going to guide you through Note D here. So I hope you have your headphones in and you can hear a little bit about spatial geography as we wrap up Unit 1. So spatial geography refers to how we name our places around the world. How do we actually take a specific area and give it a certain name? So we're going to go through a couple different terms here. The first is continent. A continent refers to one of the largest expanses of land in the world. There are 7 of them total. Do you think you can name them before we go through them? I'll give you a minute to think about those. What are all 7 continents? Once you've had a second to think about that, let's go ahead and look at them. The 7 continents here are North America, South America, Europe, Asia, which includes the Middle East, Africa, Australia, and Antarctica, with Antarctica obviously being the least populated out of all of those. So we're going to start large. Continent is the first way that we kind of talk about space. The second way that we talk about space is we go from continents and we kind of start getting a little bit smaller. We then talk about region. Okay, regions are broad areas that are typically divided by physical characteristics or human characteristics. For example, if we look at this top right map, you'll see here in orange is North America. It's characterized by its common language, by its common laws, and other commonalities. Then as we move down, we get into maybe Latin America, the Caribbean, and in South America, all different regions due to different reasons. We also see that in Europe, where we have Western Europe and Eastern Europe. Then we have all of Russia kind of as its own region. South Africa is a different region than North Africa and the Middle East. This actually is separated by religion. So there are many different ways that we can separate areas, and we'll talk about regions. Regions can also be economic in terms of what countries trade with each other. But for now, we'll just focus on those physical regions. Now, one step down from regions is once you get into these specific regions, then we get into countries. A country is a nation with its own government that occupies a particular territory. Obviously, one of the largest countries that or the most common country we can think of would be the United States, but there are hundreds of countries throughout the world, all who claim different areas. Okay. Then we have a province. Our next kind of area down would be a province. A province is a territory within a country that is allowed to create its own laws and local rules. Now, a province is a little tricky. A province is very similar to a state that we would find in the United States. We have 50 states in our country, and Canada has 10 provinces. Now, the only difference between a province and a state is that provinces are typically a little bigger, and they are also allowed to create their own laws and local rules outside of the national government. So Canada has a lot of provinces. They're the most common, and they're very similar to our states. So let's look at states next. A state is a political entity of a larger country. Again, it's almost the same thing as a province, but it is smaller, and they have a little less control over decision making. They're governed a little bit more by the federal government. Then we move on to territory. A territory is an area of land that is under the ruling of a country. One of the best examples here is Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico is actually a territory of the United States, meaning that it is technically a part of our country, but it does not have the full rights of the state. If I go back one slide, you see in the upper left-hand corner here in Canada, the Yukon Territory and the Northwest Territories are going to be under the same thing. They're technically Canada, but they do not have the same full rights. And then last, I believe, for our definitions is a city. A city is a large settlement area of at least 2,500 people. Cities can range from small cities to megalopolises, and Harrisonburg here in our city is, somewhere between about 55 to 65,000 people, and then another 20 to 25,000 people when JMU is in session. So at our max, Harrisonburg might be about 75 to 80,000 people. And growing. You can see here Rockingham County, as a kind of a byproduct of Harrisonburg growing, has also been growing. There's about 78,000 people in the county, and just about that many in the city as well. So when we talk about maps, we just want to remember that, maps can reflect changes over time. We do not use the same maps today that we used 10 or 15 years ago. Things change, names change, sometimes boundaries change, although that's a little less common. So people used maps to show this change in perspective. And so you might ask yourself, well, what really changes? What really shows us why maps change? Well, the first one here is that what changes is knowledge. Think about on the left here a map of Columbus's time. Columbus was obviously the man who discovered the Americas, and before that he had no idea that North America existed all the way over here on the left side. So, someone like that would have said, well, what in the world is the Americas? Well, when the knowledge changed, so did the maps. Here is oops, sorry, that's stuck behind the thing. What else can change is the geographic information systems, the knowledge that we get, the understanding of our world around us and how we can create layers and different maps. That certainly can change our perspective. And then second is perspective. What else can change on a map? And the reason why there are different maps is that we can also have different perspectives. For example, this first map here on the right is a map of what Australians would use, where they actually put the South Pole at the top of their map. So when they look at Australia, you see Australia here. It is at the top of the map instead of the bottom, and then everything is kind of adjusted around it. It's definitely a very different look than what we're used to. Asian maps are typically centered on the Pacific Ocean. So this is an Asian map where the Pacific is the focus of the map, and then you can see the Americas are on the right side now instead of the left. Still what we might consider a Mercator projection, but the perspective is different as it focuses on the Pacific Ocean. And then here's a more traditional European American map that I think we are used to seeing in our country. Not necessarily right, not necessarily wrong, but definitely a little bit more common to what we're used to seeing. And then the final thing that might change, folks, are place names. Sometimes throughout history, as countries change or even ethnicities and religion change, we might also see the name of the place actually change. For example, this Gulf here typically has been called the Persian Gulf. It is a Gulf here in the Middle East where a lot of the major oil producers export their oil. And it's always been called the Persian Gulf because the Persian Empire used to live here. However, the Persian Empire has not been around for thousands of years, and so what a lot of people want to change this to is the Arabian Gulf. See these two names here. Arabian refers to the Arabs that live in that area who want to call it Arabian. So, you might ask yourself who might prefer it. Well, obviously the people of today would prefer to call it the Arabian Gulf. And yet sometimes geographers and historians will typically want to keep that more traditional name. Other examples of this are the Sea of Japan versus the East Sea. Certainly Japan, this is a little area of water here west of Japan and east of China. Certainly Japan would want to call this the Sea of Japan. They believe it's kind of theirs, or that they should be able to call it that. Whereas the Chinese and the North Koreans and South Koreans want to call that the East Sea. So it doesn't sound like it actually belongs to Japan. Again, little details, but important. And then the last thing here is what we call the Middle East, some would call Southwest Asia. That Southwest Asia refers to the fact that this is the Asian continent, and it was only called the Middle East because it used to be seen as that. Back when Europeans lived over here, and they knew that India was over here, they would call this the Middle East because India was the Far East. However, that term is really outdated because now we know that the world is round. It's really hard to know what the East is. It depends on where you start or where you live, what you might consider the East. Certainly people who live in the Middle East would not consider that to be the Middle East. So we've got to think a little bit about what we call places, and we'll talk more about this. Boundaries might also change. For example, in Africa, in 1914, this is what Africa looked like, but throughout the centuries, They have updated, and they've had a lot of different countries gain their freedom. And so Africa is going to look very different in today's world. And we also see this in the Middle East with countries like Palestine and Israel. This is a country right on the Mediterranean. Palestine was, for many years, controlled by Britain. But once they were given up, they were actually forced to allow Israel to then create their own country. And this went from Palestine to Israel and Palestine. So things can change, folks. I just want you to bear those in mind. We'll look at these specific examples as when we get into the specific regions later on in the year. But please remember what changes. Knowledge changes, perspective changes, names change, and boundaries change. And so maps can be updated, and maps have certain characteristics, but even that can change throughout time. Alright, once you're done viewing this video, make sure you take the quiz that is in Schoology, and I hope to see you all again soon. Take care.